3 simple facts that tell you nothing about the 49 years, 9 months, and 28 days he spent waiting to die. Nothing about the blood on Edwina Marter's kitchen floor. Nothing about why Mississippi kept him breathing longer than almost any other condemned man in American history. And absolutely nothing about what he whispered in those final moments before the chemicals flooded his veins. This is the story of America's second longest wait on death row, and the crime that put him there. If this story doesn't make you question everything you know about justice and mercy, then you haven't been paying attention. Smash that subscribe button because what you are about to hear will haunt you long after this video ends. Drop a comment if you think you can handle where this goes. And hit that like button, because trust me, you'll want to remember this name, Gerald Jordan. Now, let's go back to where it all began. August 1976, Gulfport, Mississippi. The air hung thick and wet the way it always does on the Gulf Coast in late summer, the kind of heat that makes your shirt cling to your back before you've even stepped outside. Edwina Marter was 69 years old, a woman who kept to herself in a modest house on a quiet street where neighbors knew each other's names and watched out for one another. Until they didn't. It was a Tuesday morning when Edwina's neighbor noticed something wrong. The newspaper still sat on the front porch, damp with dew. The curtains remained drawn at noon. No sound came from inside the house where Edwina usually had her radio playing gospel music while she tended her small garden. The neighbor knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time, calling Edwina's name through the door. Still nothing. That's when she noticed the back door, slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. The Gulfport Police Department responded within 15 minutes. Officers approached the house with hands on their holsters, that sixth sense that comes with experience telling them something was very wrong here. They pushed through the back door into the kitchen. The scene that greeted them would stay with those officers for the rest of their lives. Edwina Marter lay on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood that had gone dark and sticky in the summer heat. She had been beaten and stabbed. The brutality of it shocked even veteran investigators. This wasn't a quick murder. This was rage, desperation, or something worse. But here's where the story takes its first turn. The house hadn't been ransacked. Edwina's purse sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. Her jewelry remained in the bedroom dresser. The television, the radio, small appliances that could be easily carried and sold, all of it still there. So what did the killer want? Detective Frank Morrison led the investigation. He was a 20-year veteran of the Gulfport PD, a man who had worked everything from domestic disputes to armed robberies. But this case felt different from the start. The violence was extreme, yet the crime scene was strangely organized. Personal, but not quite a crime of passion. Morrison and his team began the painstaking work of processing the scene. They lifted fingerprints from every surface, photographed every corner of that kitchen, documented every drop of blood. In 1976, forensic science wasn't what it is today. No DNA databases, no advanced trace analysis, just fingerprints, blood types, and old-fashioned detective work. The autopsy revealed what they already suspected. Edwina had fought for her life. Defense wounds covered her hands and forearms. The medical examiner counted multiple stab wounds and evidence of blunt force trauma to her head. Time of death was estimated at sometime late Monday evening or early Tuesday morning. Morrison interviewed neighbors up and down the street. Had anyone seen anything unusual? Strange cars? Unfamiliar faces? Most had nothing to offer. This was a quiet neighborhood where people kept their doors locked, but didn't expect violence to come knocking. But one neighbor remembered something. A man, early 20s, white, had been walking up and down the street the day before the murder. He'd stopped at several houses, seeming to ask questions or look for addresses. The neighbor couldn't remember much else, just that something about him seemed off. Nervous, maybe, or high. It wasn't much, but it was something. The fingerprints lifted from Edwina's house went to the lab for comparison. In the meantime, Morrison dug into Edwina's life. She was a widow, had been for 15 years. Her husband had worked at the shipyard before a heart attack took him in 1961. She had no enemies that anyone knew of. No debts. No disputes with neighbors. No angry relatives waiting in the wings. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary woman who should have lived out her remaining years in peace. 3 days after the murder, the lab called with results. They had a match on the fingerprints. The name that came back was Richard Gerald Jordan, 23 years old, with a criminal record that told a story of its own. Jordan had convictions for burglary and robbery. He'd done time in Parkman Prison, Mississippi's notorious state penitentiary. He'd been released on parole just 8 months before Edwina Marter was killed. And according to parole records, he'd been staying with relatives in Gulfport less than 2 miles from Edwina's house. Morrison put out a warrant for Jordan's arrest. But when officers went to the address on file, Jordan was gone. His relatives claimed they hadn't seen him in days, maybe a week. They weren't sure. He came and went. A manhunt began. For 2 weeks, Richard Gerald Jordan stayed one step ahead of the police. He disappeared into the network of back roads and small towns that crisscross southern Mississippi, moving between the homes of friends and distant family members who either didn't know he was wanted for murder or didn't care enough to turn him in. But Jordan made a mistake. He tried to sell a watch at a pawn shop in Biloxi, 20 miles from Gulfport. The pawnbroker, suspicious of the nervous young man, wrote down his license plate number after he left. When the police ran it, they found it registered to Jordan's cousin. Officers staked out the cousin's house. They waited, and on a humid evening in early September, Richard Gerald Jordan pulled into the driveway. He didn't resist arrest. When officers approached with weapons drawn, Jordan simply raised his hands and said, "I know why you're here." Back at the station, Jordan waived his right to remain silent. He wanted to talk, he said. He wanted to explain. What he told Detective Morrison over the next 6 hours would seal his fate for nearly half a century. Jordan admitted to being inside Edwina Marter's house. He admitted to the violence. But his story, the details he gave, the reasons he offered, none of it quite added up. Parts contradicted themselves. Other parts seemed rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say. Morrison pressed him on the inconsistencies. Jordan's story shifted, changed shape, took on new details that hadn't been there before. By the end of the interrogation, Morrison was certain of 2 things. Richard Gerald Jordan had killed Edwina Marter, and there was something he wasn't telling them about why. The trial came fast by today's standards. By April 1977, Jordan sat in a Harrison County courtroom facing capital murder charges. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the fingerprints, Jordan's criminal history, his own confession. They painted a picture of a violent repeat offender who had brutally murdered an elderly woman in her own home. Jordan's defense attorney argued that the confession had been coerced, that the physical evidence was circumstantial, that reasonable doubt existed. But the fingerprints were damning. Jordan's own words were damning. And in the Mississippi of 1977, with emotions running high and a community demanding justice for one of their own, the outcome seemed inevitable. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Richard Gerald Jordan guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, Edwina's family members took the stand. They spoke of a kind woman who had harmed no one, who had deserved to live out her years in peace. They spoke of their loss, their grief, their desire for justice. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed. On May 3, 1977, Richard Gerald Jordan was formally sentenced to death by lethal gas and transferred to Unit 29 at Mississippi State Penitentiary. He was 24 years old. What no one in that courtroom knew, not the judge, not the jury, not even Jordan himself, was that he would spend the next 49 years, 9 months, and 28 days waiting to die. But why did Mississippi keep him alive for so long? What was happening behind the walls of Parkman Prison during those decades? And what truth about Edwina Marter's murder remained hidden until Jordan's final hours? Parkman Prison, 1977. Unit 29 sat like a concrete tomb in the middle of the Mississippi Delta, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. This was where Mississippi sent its condemned men to wait. The rows of cells were narrow, suffocating, designed for nothing but containment. Richard Gerald Jordan walked into his 6-by-9-foot cell, and the door clanged shut behind him with a finality that echoed down the corridor. He was the youngest man on death row that year. He would become the oldest. In 1977, America was in the middle of a complicated dance with capital punishment. The Supreme Court had reinstated the death penalty just 1 year earlier, after a 4-year moratorium. States were scrambling to rewrite their laws, to create execution protocols that would pass constitutional muster. Mississippi, like many southern states, was eager to resume executions. They had the death chamber ready. They had the gas chamber prepared. What they didn't have was clarity on how to navigate the appeals process that would define death penalty cases for the next half-century. Jordan's case entered the legal machinery immediately. His court-appointed attorney filed an automatic appeal to the Mississippi Supreme Court, as required by law in all capital cases. This was standard procedure, the first of what would become dozens of appeals, habeas, petitions, and legal challenges that would keep Jordan alive long past the life expectancy of the average American man. But while the lawyers argued over procedural issues and constitutional questions, Jordan adapted to life on death row. Former inmates who served time in Unit 29 during those years describe it as a place where time moved differently. Days blurred together in a monotonous routine of meals delivered through slots, 1 hour of recreation in a caged yard, and endless stretches of silence broken only by the sounds of men losing their minds. Some prisoners screamed, others wept, some simply went quiet, disappearing into themselves until there was nothing left but a breathing body in a concrete box. Jordan did none of these things. Guards who worked Unit 29 in the early 1980s remember him as quiet, polite, even. He read voraciously, devouring every book and magazine the prison library could provide. He wrote letters to family members, who gradually stopped writing back as the years stretched on. He exercised in his cell, push-ups and sit-ups, maintaining his body even as the system worked to destroy it, and he waited. The appeals process ground forward with the speed of continental drift. Jordan's case bounced between state and federal courts, each level examining different aspects of his trial, his conviction, his sentence. His lawyers argued ineffective assistance of counsel. They argued that his confession had been coerced. They argued that the jury selection process had been flawed. Courts denied these appeals one after another, but each denial triggered the right to appeal to a higher court, and so the cycle continued. In 1983, Mississippi executed Jimmy Lee Gray in the gas chamber. He was the first person executed in the state since 1964. Gray had murdered a 3-year-old girl, and there was no public sympathy for him. Officials thought this would open the floodgates, that executions would resume on a regular schedule. Instead, the opposite happened. Gray's execution became notorious because witnesses reported that he appeared to suffer, that he thrashed and convulsed for an abnormally long time before dying. The spectacle triggered new legal challenges about cruel and unusual punishment. Mississippi's execution schedule ground to a halt again. Jordan kept waiting. Throughout the 1980s and 1990 seconds, the population of Unit 29 changed around him. New inmates arrived, their cases moving through the same appeals process. Some won new trials. Some had their sentences commuted to life, and some were executed as Mississippi sporadically resumed putting prisoners to death. But Jordan remained, caught in a unique legal limbo that nobody quite understood. Here's what was happening behind the scenes, the part that wouldn't become clear until decades later. Jordan's case had become a test case for multiple legal questions. His attorney, later attorneys actually, kept finding new grounds for appeal. Not frivolous claims, but legitimate constitutional questions about evidence, about jury instructions, about the evolving standards of what constituted a fair capital trial. And Mississippi, for reasons that varied over time, never pushed hard enough to resolve these issues quickly. Sometimes it was budget constraints defending against appeals cost money. Sometimes it was political will governors and attorneys general had other priorities. Sometimes it was simply the complexity of a legal system that had grown so Byzantine that no one could navigate it efficiently anymore. In 1998, Mississippi switched from lethal gas to lethal injection as its method of execution. Jordan's death warrant had specified the gas chamber. Now, that method was no longer used. Did that warrant still apply? More legal motions, More delays. Jordan turned 40, then 50. His hair went gray. His body began to show the wear of decades in a concrete cell. He developed health problems: high blood pressure, diabetes, the physical toll of a life lived entirely indoors under fluorescent lights. Other inmates who had arrived on death row decades after him were executed. Jordan watched the system pass him by, carrying out the death penalty on men whose crimes came long after his, whose cases were supposedly further behind in the appeals process. Why was he still alive? The question haunted Jordan. It haunted prison officials. It haunted legal observers who watched his case drag on year after year with no resolution in sight. In 2007, Jordan had spent 30 years on death row. He gave a rare interview to a legal advocacy group studying long-term death row confinement. His words were measured, careful, the product of 3 decades of forced introspection. "I did what they said I did," Jordan told the interviewer. "I'm not saying I'm innocent, but I've been ready to die for a long time now. This waiting, this limbo, it's worse than the execution would be. They're torturing me with uncertainty." The interviewer asked if he had remorse for killing Edwina Marter. Jordan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would take on new meaning years later. "I am sorry for what happened that night, but the full truth about why I was there, what really happened, that's something I've kept to myself. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe it never mattered." What did he mean by that? The question hung in the air, unanswered. By 2015, Jordan had been on death row for 38 years. Mississippi had executed only 21 people in that entire time. The state's death penalty system was under increasing scrutiny. Civil rights groups argued that the lengthy delays themselves constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Some death penalty supporters agreed, arguing that justice delayed was justice denied. But still, Jordan's case dragged on. Then, in 2021, something changed. Mississippi, facing criticism over the age and condition of death row inmates who had been waiting for decades, began to prioritize resolving the oldest cases. New attorneys general, new governors, new political winds blowing through the state capitol in Jackson. Jordan's case was dusted off and examined. His appeals had been exhausted. Every court that could rule on his case had ruled. There was no legal impediment to carrying out his sentence. Except one problem. Jordan was now 68 years old, in poor health, and had spent nearly 45 years on death row. Executing him now would be purely symbolic, some argued. Others said justice delayed wasn't justice denied, it was still justice, and Edwina Marter deserved it regardless of how long it took. The debate raged in legal journals and opinion pages. But inside Unit 29, Jordan simply waited for someone to make a decision. In January 2026, that decision came. Mississippi Attorney General's office filed papers requesting an execution date for Richard Gerald Jordan. After 48 years, 9 months, they said, it was time. The court agreed. Jordan's execution was scheduled for November 2026. When guards informed him of the date, Jordan reportedly nodded and said, "Finally." The months leading up to his execution were strange. Media interest exploded. Here was a man who had spent longer on death row than almost anyone in American history. Reporters wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted access. Legal scholars wanted to study his case as an example of everything broken in America's capital punishment system. Jordan declined most requests, but he did agree to one final interview with a Mississippi journalist who had covered his case for years. In that interview, conducted in September 2026, just 2 months before his scheduled execution, Jordan finally opened up about things he'd kept silent for decades. He talked about his childhood in poverty, about addiction problems that started when he was 14, about a life that seemed destined for prison long before he ever met Edwina Marter. But when the conversation turned to the murder itself, to that August night in 1976, Jordan became evasive. "There are things I never told the police," he said. "Things I never told my lawyers. Things that wouldn't have changed the outcome of my trial, but might have changed how people understood what happened." The reporter pressed him. What things? What hadn't he told them? Jordan smiled, a sad expression that held 50 years of secrets. Maybe I'll tell the truth in my final statement. Maybe I'll take it to my grave. I haven't decided yet." As November 2026 approached, preparations began at Parkman. The execution chamber, which hadn't been used in several years, was inspected and tested. The lethal injection protocol was reviewed. Witnesses were selected: victims' family members, state officials, media representatives. And Jordan was asked about his final meal. In this modern era, Mississippi no longer allowed elaborate last meal requests, but inmates could request something simple within a modest budget. Some chose steak, others chose fast food, some chose comfort food from their childhood. Gerald Jordan requested a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The simplicity of it struck everyone. After 49 years waiting to die, after all the legal battles and media attention and controversy, his final request was the simplest meal imaginable. When asked why, Jordan reportedly said, "Because it reminds me of being a kid, before everything went wrong." The day of execution arrived on November 15, 2026. Jordan was 71 years old. He had spent 49 years, 9 months, and 28 days on death row, the second longest wait in American history. At p.m., guards came to his cell to begin the final procedures. Jordan walked to the execution chamber under his own power. He was strapped to the gurney. IVs were inserted. Witnesses filed into the observation room. The warden asked if Jordan had any final words. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would he finally reveal the secrets he'd hinted at? Would he explain what really happened that night in 1976? Would he offer the truth that had remained hidden for half a century? Jordan looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at the witnesses. His eyes found someone in the observation room, a woman in her 60s, crying silently. She was Edwina Marter's granddaughter, there to see justice finally carried out. Jordan spoke clearly, his voice steady. "I want to say that I'm sorry for taking Edwina Marter's life. But there's something you need to know, something the police never figured out, something I've kept quiet all these years, because I thought it didn't matter anymore." The room held its breath. The only sound was the quiet hum of the medical equipment. "Edwina Marter wasn't a stranger to me," Jordan continued. "We knew each other. And the reason I was at her house that night," the warden interrupted. Time was up. The execution had to proceed. Jordan closed his eyes. "I guess some truths die with us," he whispered. The chemicals began to flow. Jordan took a last breath, then another. His body relaxed. 3 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. But his final words had changed everything. If Jordan knew Edwina Marter, if there was a connection between them that police never discovered, then what was the real story behind her murder? What truth had died with Jordan on that gurney? The investigation had been closed for 49 years. But now, new questions demanded answers. Please like and subscribe. The execution chamber emptied in silence. Witnesses filed out, some crying, some stone-faced, all processing what they had just heard in those final seconds before Gerald Jordan died. Edwina Marter's granddaughter, Patricia Chen, stood frozen in the observation room, her hand pressed against the glass that separated her from the gurney where Jordan's body lay still. What did he mean? She whispered to no one in particular. How did he know my grandmother? That question would consume her for the next 3 months. But the answer had been waiting in a cardboard box in a Harrison County courthouse basement for nearly 50 years. The day after Jordan's execution, newspapers across Mississippi ran headlines about his final statement. Killer claims secret connection to victim. Death row inmates' last words raised new questions. The story went national within hours. True crime podcasts dissected every word. Internet sleuths began their own investigations. Patricia Chen contacted the Gulfport Police Department. She wanted to see the original case file, she said. She wanted to understand what Jordan meant. She needed to know if there was something about her grandmother's death that the family had never been told. Detective Marcus Webb, who now headed the cold case unit, pulled the Jordan file from archives. It was thick, stuffed with 49 years of legal documents, appeals, and procedural motions. But beneath all that legal paperwork were the original investigation files from 1976. Webb spread the documents across a conference table. Patricia sat across from him, her hands trembling as she looked at crime scene photos she'd never seen before, at witness statements, at evidence logs that cataloged every item found in her grandmother's house that terrible August night. Your family was told everything relevant at the time, Webb said gently. The case was solid. Jordan's fingerprints, his confession, his criminal history, but he said they knew each other. Patricia interrupted. He said that's why he was there. The police never mentioned any connection. Webb frowned. He pulled out the original detective's notes, written in Detective Frank Morrison's careful handwriting. Morrison had died in 1998, but his investigation had been thorough. Webb read through the interviews, the timeline, the evidence analysis. Nothing indicated that Jordan and Edwina Marter had any prior relationship. But then Webb noticed something. In the evidence log, there was an entry for items taken from Edwina's house that were directly related to the murder scene. Standard procedure was to document everything, even things that seemed irrelevant. Most of these items had been returned to the family after the trial. One item caught Webb's attention: personal correspondence, box of letters, non-evidentiary. Did your family receive a box of your grandmother's letters after the trial? Webb asked Patricia. She shook her head. I don't remember anything like that. My mother handled all of grandmother's belongings. She died 5 years ago. Webb made a call to the property room. 20 minutes later, a clerk appeared with a sealed evidence box marked with Jordan's case number. It had been sitting in storage for nearly half a century, never opened after the trial because it had been deemed irrelevant to the prosecution's case. Webb cut the seal. Inside were stacks of letters, mostly correspondence between Edwina and her late husband, between Edwina and her children. Normal family letters, birthday cards, that sort of thing. But at the bottom of the box was a bundle of letters tied with a string. These were different. The envelopes were addressed to Edwina, but there was no return address. The postmarks dated from 1974 to 1976, the 2 years before her murder. Webb opened the first letter. The handwriting was neat, careful, the writing of someone who had time to compose their thoughts. It began, "Dear Mrs. Marter, thank you for your letter and for the money. It means more than you know. Prison is hard, but knowing there are good people like you on the outside makes it bearable." The signature at the bottom read, "Richard Jordan." Patricia gasped. Webb kept reading, going through letter after letter. The correspondence painted a picture that no one had seen in 1976, a connection that had been sitting in an evidence box all along, ignored because it didn't fit the narrative of a random killing during a burglary gone wrong. The story that emerged from those letters was this: in 1974, Richard Jordan was serving time at Parkman Prison for burglary. He was 21 years old, angry, lost, spiraling deeper into a life that seemed to have no exit. The prison had a program where community volunteers would write to inmates, offering encouragement and support. It was a small program, run through local churches, designed to give prisoners some connection to the outside world. Edwina Marter had volunteered. She was assigned to write to Richard Jordan. Their correspondence started formally, awkwardly. Edwina wrote about her garden, about her neighborhood, about the simple pleasures of life outside prison walls. Jordan wrote back with guarded responses, testing whether this woman was genuine or just fulfilling some religious obligation. But over months, something shifted. Edwina became more than a pen pal. She became a lifeline. When Jordan's own family stopped visiting, stopped writing, Edwina kept her letters coming. When he had no money for basic necessities in the prison commissary, Edwina sent small amounts of cash. $20 here, $30 there. "You remind me of my son," Edwina wrote in one letter from late 1974. "He made mistakes, too. He died young, and I never got to help him turn his life around. Maybe I can help you instead." Jordan's letters back showed a vulnerability he'd never displayed in any police interrogation or court proceeding. "You're the only person who treats me like I'm still human," he wrote. "Everyone else has given up on me. But you haven't. I don't know why, but thank you." Jordan was released on parole in early 1976. The letters continued, but less frequently. Edwina wrote to check on him, to ask how he was adjusting to life outside prison. Jordan's responses were short, more evasive. He was struggling, that much was clear. He'd found work but lost it. He was staying with relatives, but the situation was unstable. The last letter from Jordan to Edwina was dated July 1976, 1 month before her murder. It was different from the others. Desperate. Mrs. Marta, I need help. I've gotten into something bad. Something I can't get out of. I owe money to people who will hurt me if I don't pay. I don't know what to do. Can I come see you? Maybe you can help me figure this out. I know it's a lot to ask. You've already done so much, but I have nowhere else to turn. There was no record of Edwina's response, but clearly, she had agreed to see him. Webb and Patricia sat in stunned silence as the full picture came into focus. Jordan hadn't broken into Edwina's house as a stranger. He'd been invited. Edwina had tried to help him one more time, just as she'd been helping him for 2 years. So what had gone wrong that August night? Webb pulled out Jordan's original confession from 1976. He read it again with new understanding. The inconsistencies that Detective Morrison had noted, the parts of Jordan's story that didn't quite make sense, they all clicked into place now. Jordan had confessed to the murder, but he'd never explained why he was there. He'd let the police assume it was a burglary. He'd let his lawyers argue over evidence and procedure, but he'd protected Edwina's reputation, even after killing her. Because if the truth had come out that she'd been corresponding with a convicted felon, that she'd been sending him money, that she'd invited him to her home, it would have changed how people remembered her. In the Mississippi of 1976, a 69-year-old white woman maintaining a secret relationship with a young white ex-convict would have been scandalous. Even innocent help would have been twisted into something ugly by gossip and judgment. Jordan had kept her secret for 49 years, but that still didn't answer the fundamental question. Why had he killed her? Webb knew they'd never get that answer from Jordan now, but he could piece it together from the evidence and the new context the letters provided. Jordan had come to Edwina that night desperate, probably high, definitely in debt to dangerous people. He'd asked her for more money than she could or would give him. They'd argued. Jordan, unstable and desperate, had snapped. The violence was explosive, the result of drugs and desperation, and a young man at the absolute end of his options. In the aftermath, standing in Edwina's kitchen with her blood on his hands, Jordan had made a choice. He could tell the truth, explain their relationship, try to make people understand that this woman had been helping him, that the murder wasn't random, but the tragic end of a good person's attempt to save someone unsavable. Or he could stay silent, let people think it was a random crime, protect Edwina's reputation even as he destroyed his own life. He chose silence. The confession he gave police was carefully constructed to avoid any mention of their relationship. He admitted to the violence, but not the context. He accepted the death penalty, but not the chance to explain himself. For 49 years, through endless appeals and legal proceedings, Jordan never once mentioned the letters, never revealed that he and Edwina Marter had known each other. Until those final words on the execution gurney, when he tried one last time to tell the truth. And even then, time ran out before he could finish. Patricia Chen wept as Webb explained what he believed had happened. She was trying to help him, Patricia said. That's who my grandmother was. She saw someone who needed help, and she helped them. And he killed her for it. But he also protected her memory, Webb said quietly. He could have made this public at any point. He could have used it in appeals, claimed there was more to the story, forced the letters into evidence. But he didn't. In his own twisted way, maybe he thought staying silent was the only way to repay her kindness. The media explosion that followed the discovery of the letters was enormous. The story had everything: secret correspondence, hidden connections, a murder that wasn't what anyone thought it was. True crime shows produced special episodes. Journalists wrote think pieces about redemption and failure, about the death penalty and justice, about whether Jordan's 49 years on death row was punishment or mercy. But for Patricia Chen, the letters brought something unexpected: closure. I spent my whole life thinking my grandmother was killed by a monster who chose her at random, Patricia said in an interview 3 months after Jordan's execution. Now, she died trying to help someone who was drowning. That doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it make sense. She died being exactly who she was: someone who believed people could change, who believed in second chances. Jordan was right about one thing, she continued. Some truths die with us, but this one didn't. And I think grandmother would want people to know that she tried. She failed, but she tried. The Gulfport Police Department officially closed the Jordan case with an addendum explaining the newly discovered connection between victim and killer. Detective Morrison's original investigation was still considered thorough and professional. He worked with the evidence available to him, and there was no way to know that crucial context was sitting in a box of letters deemed irrelevant. As for the letters themselves, Patricia donated them to the Mississippi State Archives. They sit there now, a testament to a complicated story about mercy, violence, and the impossibly thin line between helping someone and becoming their victim. Gerald Jordan spent 49 years, 9 months, and 28 days on death row. He died at 71 years old, having lived longer in prison than he'd lived free. His last meal was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. His last words were an attempt to tell a truth that had been buried for half a century. Edwina Marter was 69 when she died, murdered by someone she'd tried to save. Her kindness was both admirable and fatal. Her secret correspondence revealed after her death showed a woman who believed in redemption, even when redemption seemed impossible. 2 lives, connected by letters and violence, by good intentions and terrible outcomes. One of the longest death row waits in American history, all to protect the reputation of the woman he'd killed. Some might call it ironic, others might call it tragic, but in the end, it's simply the truth, complicated, messy, and human. The Jordan case is now studied in law schools as an example of everything that can go wrong with capital punishment, the endless delays, the legal complexity, the question of whether justice that takes half a century is justice at all. But it is also studied in ethics courses as something else entirely, a case study in moral complexity, in the impossibility of simple narratives, in how the truth is almost always more complicated than we want it to be. Gerald Jordan and Edwina Marter are both buried in Mississippi in cemeteries less than 30 miles apart. Neither got the ending they deserved, but their story, finally told in full, serves as a reminder that every crime has layers, every victim and perpetrator has a history, and sometimes the truth takes 50 years to surface. This was the story of America's second longest death row wait. But more than that, it was the story of 2 people, one who tried to save, and one who couldn't be saved, and the secret that connected them until the very end. And if this story left you thinking about justice, mercy, and the complexity of human nature, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this, more truths hiding in plain sight, more cases that will challenge everything you think you know. Drop a comment with your thoughts on Jordan's 49-year wait. Was it justice or torture? And remember, behind every crime statistic is a story far more complicated than the headlines suggest. Until the next case, stay curious, stay critical, and never assume you know the whole story.